Let us turn our attention now to the first major chapter in the first part of Johannes Climacus, or De Omnibus Datium Est, that everything must be doubted, which turns its attention to that question that modern philosophy begins with doubt. Before we can proceed, we need to remember that this question of modern philosophy beginning with doubt really starts with the thought project of Descartes and what we saw in his meditations. Descartes mentioned that, he understood that many of the opinions to which he had been entertaining on thought he needed to decide might need to go away. He needs to cast these out because there could be some error in them. And then anything built off of those would therefore be an error as well. And so that his task in his own notion of what it is to be a modern philosopher was to begin by doubting everything. This was the work and the task of the meditations. Kierkegaard is familiar with this concept, familiar with this idea. He's hearing lectures by people around him, Martensen, for instance, who are drawing off of Descartes in this notion of De Omnibus Datium Est. He's reading and encountering Kant, and Kant's reference to Descartes with the phrases the cognito ergo sum, right? The I'm a thing which thinks, I think, therefore I am statements, and connecting this with the De Omnibus Datium Est, seeing this as the foundation for Protestant subjectivity, an idea of subjectivity that Kierkegaard entertained in many of his works as well. And there is also a connection here with Hegel and his phenomenology of spirit in that discussion of skepticism. Hegel here saying that skepticism, which ends with the abstraction of nothingness or emptiness, can advance from this not a step farther, but must wait and see whether there is a possibility of anything new offered, and what that is, in order to cast into that same abysmal void. Whence one, on the other hand, the result is apprehended. It is truly a determinate negation. A new form has thereby immediately arisen, and the negation, the transition is made by which the progress through the complete succession of forms comes about of itself. In other words, we're seeing the basic form and structure of this Hegelian dialectic being introduced because there is doubt of one idea, and then the thesis of the idea gets questioned by the antithesis of doubt, and the new idea is going to be progressed, that this is the unfolding Geist that Hegel talks about as well, that we have these three philosophers being brought in, and Martensen, if we'd like to include him as well, but that this becomes the basis for this philosophy, for this task that's being done. You can read a little bit more about this in the footnotes and the endnotes that the authors thankfully are including here, the translators. So let us begin. Modern philosophy begins with doubt. What struck him at once in these three theses, once again, these three theses are that philosophy begins with doubt. In order to philosophize, one must have doubted, and modern philosophy begins with doubt. So what strikes him at once with these three theses was that they did not seem to be at all of the same kind. Although in a strict sense the first two, owing to their universality, had to be regarded as philosophical because they said something universal concerning the philosophy of every age and the place, or the philosophizer of every age and place. And the third one seemed to be a historical report that would have to undergo a transformation before it could claim to be philosophical nature in the strictest sense. Historically, it could indeed be interesting to learn that modern philosophy begins with doubt, in the same way that it could be interesting to learn whether it begins in Germany or France or with whom. So the question is what is the beginning of modern philosophy? When's this era of modern philosopher? And I guess if doubt is this first question, that's kind of interesting, but it's kind of trivial, as if it's, okay, was it in Germany or France or in England or where? If, however, a transformation did occur, then it probably would be subsumed under one of these previous theses. In order to check whether this was so, he decided to explore it, and that's what we will do moving forward. Here he tried to explain the possible significance of adding to the word philosophy the adjective modern. We're going to try to find some answers through linguistic use, which, of course, the term modern is a historical predicate. The term modern means something. It's not just a random term. Now, what it means is something that is a little bit up for debate. After all, Abelard described his attempts at philosophy as modern. Kierkegaard is engaged with what he's thinking is modern philosophy, which likely wouldn't include Abelard, as it probably doesn't for most of you, as early Middle Ages doesn't seem modern. The idea of when modernity begins, and is this an ever-changing thing? Is it always on the cusp? Does it have a shelf life? And after a certain amount of time, you can no longer call it modern. Can I call the telephone a modern invention? Can I call the telegraph a modern invention? How about smoke signals? How about writing itself? At one point, you're probably saying, no, one of these things isn't modern. But the question is why, and what does this mean? And what does adding the term modern to these distinctions mean for us? And again, this is a historical question, probably as much as it is relating to the object, philosophy. But accepting the idea that the term modern has a reference to a specific historical philosophy is something that Johannes Climacus here just accepts as true. For neither his reading nor his development was adequate for an investigation of it. And he mentioned already he's not a historian. The thesis implied an older philosophy that had not begun in the same way, for otherwise the thesis would be very imperfectly propounded. We're going to have to assume from what is said that older philosophy probably didn't begin with doubt, because we're using that as a signifier that this is the difference for modern philosophy beginning with doubt. He then asked whether it could be justified in concluding that a more recent philosophy could in turn begin in another way, and therefore that philosophy could begin in various ways and yet continue to be philosophy. How many different ways can philosophy be done? Not just schools of thought within philosophy, but could we start with something different than doubt? Can we now start with an assertion of something is to be true? Can we be an apologist for something and that be the beginning of a more recent philosophy? Could that indeed be the reasons for an older philosophy? Could philosophy begin with rhetoric? Could philosophy begin with any of these other things, practical concerns, as opposed to more esoteric? By the way, these aren't just half-handed questions, because we could look at different eras of philosophy and say, all right, well, here in the patristic period, it probably started a little bit more as an apologetic with our discussions of Justin Martyr. While Augustine, in this next period of philosophy, maybe one of the earlier stages of medieval, however you'd like to define it, I would put it a little bit later into medieval, but this era of philosophy began with rhetoric. Then we have other philosophy that begins with dialectic, this return to dialectic. There's also other strains of philosophy that are far more concerned with practical issues. And we can also include later discussions of pragmatism as an era of philosophy, not that different than what Kierkegaard's engaged in here too, that doesn't begin with doubt, but with subjectivity and the idea of what can be true, at least lowercase t true for now, and tomorrow be false. It doesn't begin with doubt, but it begins engaging with something. By the way, the same thing could even be said of Hegelian philosophy, right? Hegel says you got to just dive into the stream. You can't keep going back forever to find something that can be true. Modern philosophy, at least looking at some modern philosophers, depending on how you'd like to define modern, especially putting ourselves here in the early 19th century with Kierkegaard, would probably be someone around Descartes, but maybe even later. Maybe it is with Kant, and therefore we might even say before modern philosophy began, doubt was there. And it shouldn't surprise us that he continues a few lines down that, to be as brief as possible, he asked whether a later philosophy in turn could begin in the same way as that older philosophy and yet be philosophy, or whether after modern philosophy had begun with doubt, that this would have a decisive influence on the whole future. If so, would modern philosophy also have a retroactive power, so that the extent to which that older philosophy can be called philosophy would become dubious, even though that older philosophy began with something else? Some of you think of the idea of philosophy being used as an apologetic or rhetoric. It isn't real philosophy. It's real philosophy of what comes later that begins with doubt. And if you're trying to affirm an argument, a position, then that might not truly be philosophy. Maybe you're saying you need more introspection, even though that apologetic might have begun with doubt. That dialectic or rhetoric could have begun with doubt, but not as the main thrust, not as the goal, not of what's being produced and given forward. So maybe does this have retroactive power that it changes how we're going to look at these older things? That is, if because of its beginning modern philosophy has excluded for all future time the possibility of another beginning, this suggests that the beginning is more than a historical beginning, but an essential beginning. If it's essential that all philosophy begins with doubt, then why are we bothered at all with engaging into this term of modern, of having a historical predicate, if indeed we think that this is what is essential for philosophy? In that case, modern philosophy is essential philosophy, and to call that older version of philosophy is merely an accommodation. That older version of philosophy isn't really philosophy. It's only kind of philosophy. It's only philosophy because, well, those guys hung around before Socrates, and they were kind of all calling themselves the lovers of wisdom, as, Pythagoras did and others. So I guess they used the term, but they didn't know what they were doing, so don't want to really call them philosophers, which sounds a little patronizing, but maybe, if indeed doubt is this essential characteristic, if the words were to be interpreted in this manner, the thesis would thereby have undergone the transformation by which it would become identical with the first thesis, that philosophy begins with doubt. If this is what we mean, then there is really no difference between saying philosophy begins with doubt and modern philosophy begins with doubt. That the first and the third theses are one and the same. Whether this was philosophy's position, he did not know. He sought in vain to find an illuminating clue in the discourse of others. If this was the view, then it seemed strange to him that people talked so imprecisely, that they confused historical and eternal categories in such a way that when they seemed to be saying something historical, they were saying something eternal. Why did they not limit themselves to the first thesis, that philosophy begins with doubt? For then nothing is doubtful. Then everything that does not begin with doubt, whether it may be otherwise, is not philosophy. True enough, this would have had the odd result that the eternal beginning had begun in time in such a manner that there had been ages in which it had not begun, whereas he pictured the eternal beginning as present in every age. If he had understood correctly Christianity's claim that it had come into the world by the beginning that is simultaneously historical and eternal, had caused philosophy much difficulty. It must then be risky for philosophy to want to say the same thing regarding itself. And if indeed we're going to have this idea that otherwise philosophy enters into the world at the same time as doubt enters the world, and yet these are eternal categories, then this is going to cause its own sense of confusion and frustration. Following on 135. From another side also, Johannes Climacus made the words of the theses an object of deliberation. The thesis states, modern philosophy. It does not speak of a particular philosopher who is historically reported to have begun with doubting, but speaks of modern philosophy as a whole. It does not use a historical tense or a present in the historical style, such as one would be saying that Descartes begins with doubt. Again, these are different theses, different conclusions, although one nevertheless intends to designate that this is something past that is present only in the historical narrative. One uses an eternal present, as if modern philosophy is also something more than a particular philosopher. Is there a difference between an era of philosophy and an individual philosopher? And how do we categorize these? How do we divide them? Is it matter about location? Because would we want to say modern philosophy begins with existentialism with Kierkegaard? I've got some affinity towards this idea because I like Kierkegaard and this work, but I actually wouldn't say that modern philosophy begins with this. This is about choices and decisions. It's not necessarily about doubt. It's about knowing how to proceed and move forward. In many ways, this shares overlap with pragmatism, which is at the same era and a different location, but at the same time, it is also at odds with Hegelian philosophy, which is slightly before it, and not all forms of either pragmatism or existentialism are the same. So what are we going to do with this, and how should we proceed? We might use an eternal present as if modern philosophy is also something more than a particular philosopher. Modern philosophy, continues on, about halfway through 135, must be assumed to be even yet in the process of becoming. Otherwise, there already would be something more modern in relation to which it would be older. It is, as we actually mentioned already, this term modern was being used by Abelard. It is not conceivable that modern philosophy, as it advanced and spread, became aware of its own wrong beginning, which regarded as a beginning would prove not to be a beginning. But what authority is this beginning declared a beginning for all modern philosophy? Right? Why is it that if modern is something that's always becoming, and becoming for a millennia or more, that we would want to say that philosophy, therefore, this modern type of philosophy, is always going to need to begin the same way, always has this unfolding over and over again as modernity continues to move and progress. This can be correct only if the beginning itself, he says, is an essential beginning. For modern philosophy, but historically speaking, this cannot be decided until modern philosophy is concluded in its entirety. Right? You can't make a claim that this is how this era began if this era is always in the act of becoming. Therefore, it never truly is arrived, it never truly concluded. You can only speak of how an era or how some type of region, historically, locally, etc., was when you can say it's now over and concluding. That this was the hallmark of this era, of this empire, of these people, or their ideas. If it is asserted before that time, it must be said and understood eternally. In other words, it must be because this beginning is an essential beginning for all philosophy. In that case, the thesis has once again undergone a transformation where it has become identical with the first thesis, namely that philosophy begins with doubt. If this is indeed an essential category for philosophy, then it doesn't matter if it's modern philosophy or not. This is what we would say about all philosophy. Why then did philosophy use two expressions? one which either says the same as the other and is, according to that assumption, incorrect, or it says something else, and if that is assigned, is obscure. Although the ambiguity of the thesis, as it has now become apparent to him, could have made him think twice about going farther, Johannes nevertheless decided to test its implications by assuming for the time being that it was a historical thesis. As such, then, it would be different from the first thesis, and he would have only the choice of assuming either that it was a total superfluity, which could only have a disturbing effect, or that it was somewhat oddly expressed historical thesis. So we're going to assume that this is still true, and we're going to kind of tease out what this means, even though it might be a superfluous explanation. This word might not be necessary. It might just be a vestige of, people speaking incorrectly. And at that point, it's not an accurate statement because, again, you're having extraneous information that doesn't actually contribute to the idea. Part 2. How did it happen that modern philosophy began with doubt? Johannes assumed that modern philosophy began with doubt and now asked how it happened. Now let's just move along. Let's take this giant question out of the first part and say, let's just assume it to be true, and let's move forward. Whether it was by accident or by necessity, whether this beginning was an accidental or necessary beginning. Now, some of us might pause and say, what difference would that make? But it has a lot to do with a lot. If it's necessary, then it's either going to be a quality that's necessary for modernity or for philosophy. If it's for modernity, then we can change our question and just say that modernity begins with doubt. And philosophy of that era went along with it. If it's about philosophy, if philosophy must begin with doubt, then once again we go back to that earlier question that it wasn't necessary to discuss this before because it's all philosophy, not just modern philosophy. If it's by accident, if it's an accidental attribute, then what does this mean also to the nature of philosophy or that of modernity, depending on which of these terms we want to emphasize more? Because there is this sort of division that needs to take place. So, was it by accident that modern philosophy begins with doubt is our question. At this point, Johannes Climacus asks whether it was by accident, like that which purple was discovered. Now, if you go back to the end notes here, you'll see the story of purple, the dye, not the observation of the color, was discovered when a dog was consuming shells on the seashore, and then that becomes the source of this dye. It was an accident. If this dog hadn't been consuming shellfish, then the dye, the source for it, would never have been discovered, and the rarity of this and the value of wearing purple and being royal wouldn't mean much of anything. An accident, he says, of such a nature that it would forever remain an accident. It never would have happened at all. If that were the case, then the thesis that modern philosophy begins with doubt would contain a historical accident from which nothing can be concluded with respect to either a priori or subsequent philosophy, or to philosophy in general, no more than one would dare to conclude from what happened to that dog that every dog must discover purple. And if it's not necessary, if it's simply an accident, then it's just a odd historical thing. It just happened, but it doesn't have any weight, doesn't mean anything in a broader category. Like we shouldn't say all dogs discovered purple or all people discovered gunpowder, as was addressed in the earlier work, that these are just historical things that we can kind of tease out. But if this is essential, then that's going to mean something different. And again, we need to understand that there's a division between things that are essential and those things that are accidental. And we can go back to discussions of Aristotle and, of course, how the idea is going to be used with Aquinas and others about essential categories and accidental qualities. What is essentially you as opposed to accidentally you? There are certain things that have these contained, or at least are argued that way by certain philosophers. Maimonides talks about how God has no that outside of his what. Right? That God has no accidental qualities, that all things belong to God properly. We get further discussion about the notions of what is accidental and essential when we're addressing Scotus and his doctrine of the univocity of being and Peter O'Reilly's disagreement with him. Right? We tease out these things a little bit more about what are essential qualities and what are accidental qualities. But if doubt is an accidental quality to modern philosophy, Climacus continues, then that thesis would not only contain a merely historical report, but would contradict the first thesis that philosophy begins with doubt. For if these theses are juxtaposed, it would appear that the essential happened accidentally. And how can something essential be accidental if it's essential? He then asked whether the accident by which modern philosophy came to begin with doubt was perhaps of such a nature that it concealed a necessity that in the next moment explained the accidental. Whether that accident was of the same nature as the accident by which Newton discovered the law of gravity, for although it was an accident, yet the law it discovered immediately explained the accident itself as a necessity. Right? The apple falling upon Newton's head, this common story, right? It was an accident. He could have not been sitting there. But the fact that it happened, it explained the action itself. And so is it this sort of reflexive thing that is explaining its own cause, but didn't have to come into being? If so, then it would only appear to be the case, in a defective historical sense, that modern philosophy had by accident begun with doubt, since at the same moment modern philosophy would have to discover the necessity of its beginning that way. This necessity for modern philosophy as a historical document could not be as yet discovered, inasmuch as modern philosophy is not as yet concluded. If, then, this necessity was discovered, it would have to be in the eternal sense, because modern philosophy would be, philosophically, in general, this discovery would then be decisive for the whole future and be retroactive for the whole past with respect to the beginning of philosophy. If it's essential, then again, all future philosophy would begin this way, and all past philosophy would have as well. To that extent, then, this thesis would have undergone a transformation, whereby it would become identical, once again, to that first thesis. Right, so we need to understand what we mean by accident and how we want to understand the notions of substance and accident, or accidental versus necessary. We can tease this out from the time of Aristotle forward and engage in various debates, either Maimonides as opposed to Gregory of Palamas, who would make a distinction between the two as far as what is essential categories of God as opposed to God's essence versus God's energies, for instance, for Palamas. Or Scotus and his argument with Peter O'Reilly on the whole issue of being and how we need to understand this. And again, we can tease this idea out a lot more amongst other philosophers as well of what is necessary and what is accidental. So if we're going to be hesitant, at least, about saying that it's accidental, because then we're left with going back to that first thesis. Do we want to hold that it was necessary that modern philosophy began with doubt? And what would that mean? He continues on 137. Now he asked what the nature of that which preceded must have been in order to necessitate modern philosophy's beginning with doubt, whether that which preceded was a philosophy or something else. Answering his own question, he decided that, according to the wording of the thesis, it had to be a philosophy. Right? Would we want to say that things that happened before modern philosophy, things that didn't begin with doubt, wasn't a philosophy? Well, then no, we're going to say it was a philosophy. But again, it wouldn't have had to begin with doubt, otherwise we return again to that first thesis. So, of what nature must the philosophy have been that could make it necessary for modern philosophy to begin with doubt? What was the nature of it? What was the conclusions that made it so that way modern philosophy can begin in this way? Whether that philosophy, which by way of its precedents had made it necessary for modern philosophy to begin with doubt, whether that philosophy and modern philosophy alone were philosophy, so that if they were formerly had been a philosophy in the world that had begun some other way, that philosophy would have to reconcile itself to not being philosophy. He inquired further that accident philosophy itself was begun by accident or by necessity. So if this other thing that we would say, yeah, it's kind of not really philosophy, then what is it? We'd need to know that. And, of course, did that start by whatever means that it started? Was that as an accident, or is also something that's completely necessary to itself? And again, we're left with this whole question of accidental versus necessary. And in many ways, again, this is teasing out the idea of substance and accident, of what qualities are essential in something and what isn't. To try to keep himself from going too far, he tried to explain the following. If modern philosophy, by necessity, begins with doubt, then its beginning is defined in continuity with an earlier philosophy. We would all agree with this, right? That if it's modern, it's going to be connected with what's earlier. This is why it's the same thing as opposed to the other thing being something different. Then, if we wanted to say something historical about what philosophy begins with, we presumably should rather mention that with which the accident philosophy, the antecedent to that earlier philosophy, began, inasmuch as the beginning of modern philosophy would only be a consequence within an earlier beginning. Right? So modern philosophy might have begun with doubt, but we'd probably want to know what is the beginning of all philosophy and look back and try to approach that. And again, we might take part of our discussion that we've had throughout this class and say, well, what is the beginning of philosophy? Do we want to go back to those pre-Socratics and say that how they defined philosophy is right? We go back to that question we had at the very beginning of this class of, what is philosophy? What does it mean? Is it something that simply begins with doubt? And then again, that returns to the notion of modern philosophy, or that first thesis that indeed all philosophy begins with doubt. And then we're also stuck in this weird position that if the antecedent philosophy began with something other than doubt, then what does this mean about that first thesis, that philosophy begins with doubt? Then we're either equating the two or this other one has lost its meaning. Moreover, he already perceived here the difficulty that he would have to encounter later, namely, that such a consequence would be difficult to think, because the beginning with which modern philosophy began would be defined as a severance, as a break, as going its own direction. It would have to be a unique kind of consequence, namely a consequence by which the opposite results from something. This is ordinarily called a leap. And if we're breaking off, if we're moving from one thing to another, there's going to be a consequence, and it needs to be substantial enough. And this is going to require a leap, a jump. Now again, the term leap here is used intentionally. Going back to that earlier discussion, that leap is this idea of a leap of faith and connecting this new thing that begins in a different way and has a different sort of consequence with that older thing would require an act of faith to be done on your half. Otherwise, it's two separate things. For the time being, however, he clung as well as he could to the thought that it was by way of a necessary consequence that modern philosophy began with doubt. He concluded then that the beginning of modern philosophy had to be an essential beginning for philosophy, since one certainly could not be justified, except merely historically and accidentally, in declaring something essential about a development as yet unfinished. After all, the beginning might turn out to be no beginning at all, but a misunderstanding, therefore, last of all, the beginning of a philosophy. The beginning philosopher could never be justified in saying, "With me begins modern philosophy." Descartes can't say, "I am beginning philosophy, and this is modern philosophy." Again, Abelard talked about them being modern, but not that with him began modern philosophy. And again, we would look back at Abelard and go, you're kind of modern-ish, a little old for modern for most of us, right? Nor would the sanction of his successor be sufficient unless the declaration itself were something essential about all philosophy, that something needs to be there. If the statement were understood in this way, then once again the thesis would be transformed and made identical to that first thesis, that this once again is where we are left. Because we need to look at what is the issue of being necessary and how we need to understand it in these sorts of terms. Before moving on to the third part, I want to have a quick aside here, a little extra note. Highlight that this debate on what is possible and what is necessary, while it might be a little dizzying and it might be a little frustrating, you might be like, I either get it or I don't, and I'm not sure if I don't that I'm going to, but why are we doing this? I'm doubting I'm understanding any of this right now, possibly, is your thought. But this idea of what is possible and what is necessary has a long history in philosophy. Trying to figure out what is an essential characteristic of something and what is not helps us understand different schools of thought within philosophy. Pragmatism kind of argues for possibility and necessity kind of being the same thing in some ways. That the truth is true, but possibly not true. But we have to proceed as if it is true. It's much more about your actions moving forward and how you need to conceive of the world. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to move forward at all. Scotus has different arguments about what is possible too, especially what sort of contradictions can exist within the intellect. If we're going to hold that one form of a proposition is the case and yet not formulate it to be that case, right? Directly against what we would see within these pragmatists. Occam kind of gives us a little bit of a middle ground in some of this discussion, right? That we might doubt that a handful of propositions are true, but yet still hold that there's some truth within them, right? We would say that, for instance, the propositions C is E and C is A are both doubtful, dubious, and likely not the case, but yet still affirm that C is something. That some qualities are essential to an argument, to an object, and some things are not. And trying to figure out what is an accidental characteristic of something and what is a necessary characteristic and why something is necessary or not. And what would this mean that if it didn't happen this way, what would that do to the object that we're discussing is important in the broader discussion of philosophy. And while the argument is a narrative, and it's kind of flowing and kind of little points here, little points there, and you don't have the direct, formula of an argument being laid out you can tease this out a little bit more to make a larger discussion and a larger point about accidents, substance, necessary, not necessary. Hopefully that last aside wasn't unnecessary for you. Part 3. In all this deliberating, Johannes Climacus did not advance one step, and this pained him, and it might have pained you as well. Since he could not have had any confidence in such a disturbing tautology, he could not make up his mind to assume that the third thesis and the first thesis were identical. It was disturbing because it encouraged people to think something different, although what was being thought was the same. If they thought the same thing with regard to both theses, the tautology would be disturbing. He could not maintain the difference without making a little change, by which the thesis became a historical triviality, as if one said Descartes began with doubt, and several other philosophers followed his example. No objection, philosophically speaking, can ever be made against such a statement. If such a statement evoked difficulties, they would have to be historical in nature. For example, was it actually the case that they themselves said that they had done it? Or was it actually true that they had done what they had said they had done? Again, it's just a historical triviality. In vain did he hope to be enlightened by listening to the discussion of others. In vain. They used the first and third theses as totally identical at times, and stated the one and at sometimes the other, and sometimes both at once. Sometimes in the course of a conversation, one person used one thesis and the other person responded with the other, and they understood each other and understood that they were saying the same thing. The thesis remained unexplained, but an explanation was precisely what he needed, and his own private thinking had made him more receptive to instruction by others. But the explanation was not forthcoming. On the contrary, at times that the thesis was repeated so swiftly by those speaking that he almost became dizzy because of the uniformity. Then he would always return home troubled, because what seemed so easy for others, so that the way he only needed to be outlined vaguely, was so hard for him to think. He thought through the thesis again and again, tried to forget what he had thought in order to begin again, but lo and behold, he always arrived at the same point. Yet he could not abandon the thesis. It seemed as if a mysterious power held him to it, as if something were whispering to him. Something is hiding behind this misunderstanding. Right? That something, by the way, is the occasion for him to talk about what is necessary and what is possible. What is a substance and what is an accident? That's what's whispering behind it all. And thankfully, we're on this side of that discussion now, right? He then tried to combine what he had separated in thinking, that the thesis must be either purely philosophical or purely historical. Presumably, it was a mystery that modern philosophy is simultaneously the historical and the eternal. He thought, and what's more, it is aware of this itself. Indeed, it is a union similar to the union of the two natures of Christ. With every move modern philosophy makes, it becomes conscious of the eternal significance of this move. Or better stated, it becomes conscious of the significance before it makes the move. For otherwise it would be conceivable that the move itself was such that it could never acquire eternal significance unless philosophy's historical progress was absolutely identical to the idea's own movement. Right? How are we going to tease this out? Is this a historical and eternal reality coming together at once? And yet, what significance would that mean for us in relation to thought and yet modern philosophy overall? But then such a step forward would not be a historical movement. We'd return to some of that discussion we had in Philosophical Fragments, right? About us all being contemporaries with the same idea. And it seems, lo and behold, we're almost involved in that same thought project, just from a different avenue. Might be part of the reason why these two books are paired together. that in order to be admitted in the system, modern philosophy would not need to undergo any transformation, any retroactive transfiguration, any purification of forgetfulness, but down to the last little detail. It would go straight into the system, just as if it was a historical personage, were so poetic that every word, every gesture of his pure poetry. Hence, he would not need to undergo any transformation in order to go onto the stage, but could go right on from the street exactly as he walked and stood, without the least embarrassment. But it still did not become clear to him how he was to think such a combination. Restless and troubled, he was full of presentiment. He had the presentiment that it must be something out of the ordinary. He had the presentiment that to be a philosopher these days must be something indescribably difficult. If modern philosophy is like that, it must, of course, be the same for the individual philosopher. Thus, the individual philosopher must become conscious of himself, and in this consciousness of himself, also become consciousness of his significance as a moment in modern philosophy. Paused a little bit there with that notion of the moment, again drawing this connection to our last work and our last discussion that we had just finished. In modern philosophy, in turn, modern philosophy must become conscious of itself as an element in a prior philosophy, which in turn must become conscious of itself as an element in the historical unfolding of the eternal philosophy. Thus, the philosopher's consciousness must encompass the most dizzying contrasts, his own personality, his little amendment, the philosophy of the whole world as the unfolding of the eternal philosophy. And again, we're left pretty much right where we were at the other work. This moment, this connection of truth and untruth, this change of not to be to be, is once again weighing heavily in this discussion right here. If you are going to contribute to philosophy, to wisdom, you need to understand your part within wisdom, that you're giving something to wisdom, and yet it's already there, and it's going to continue to go and advance beyond you. That the truth, learning, is outside of you, and yet you have some ownership in it. Again, all of those discussions, all of those thoughts that we discussed in the first work, not to return to the Socratic once again. Should also not surprise us that this term moment, while it has decisive significance for Kierkegaard in his works, is not the normal one that Kierkegaard uses that's translated moment, but is a different term, one that's usually used by Hegel instead. And Hegel's notion of the moment here has this idea that the part has a unity with the whole, this unfolding Geist that we addressed with Hegel. And so this is the same discussion that's being done, this moments of becoming, the coming to be and yet ceasing to be, this unfolding Geist, that becoming is the unseparatedness of being and nothing, not the unity which abstracts from the being and nothing, but as the unity of being and nothing. It is this determinate unity in which there is both being and nothing, but only insofar as being and nothing that each is unseparated from each other. Right? This whole Hegelian dialectic notion as the unfolding Geist coming in here, and I would encourage you to read a little bit more on it in pages 325, 326 with the notes on this topic. But it's this term that's being used here and should be highlighted at least a little bit for your own edification. Continuing with those last few lines of 140 and moving on to 141. It was a long time before Johannes managed to think this enormous thought correctly and definitively, just as the man rolling a heavy load up a mountain is often overcome, so that his foot slips and the load rolls down. So it went with him, Finally, he was confident that he could make the movement with ease. He then decided to let the thought work with all of its weight, for he had made a distinction between the laboriousness of thinking and the weight of the thought. As historical thought, he thought the thought with ease. It's easy to understand historically, okay, this is just the way things happen. We return to the idea that Descartes began with doubt and others followed him. He had collected new strength, felt himself whole and complete. He put his shoulder, as it were, to the thought, and looked it overwhelmed, and he himself fainted, unfortunately, right? When he recovered consciousness, he hardly dared to turn his attention to that thought. It dawned on him that it could drive a person to madness, at least someone who did not have stronger nerves than he had. All the more did he admire those who were able to think such things as easily as if it was only a prank. He became discouraged, but he sank into discouragement. He once again, half against his will, grasped that enormous thought. He was actually too troubled to think properly, but it seemed to him as if that thought, which appeared to be so extremely positive, actually was a skepticism. Since the individual's knowledge was always merely knowledge about himself as a moment, and about his significance as a moment. On the presupposition that this was actually possible, something he still could not really grasp, since it was not clear to him how a moment could become conscious of itself merely as a moment, inasmuch as this consciousness was an impossibility without a consciousness that was more than a consciousness of one's self as a moment, because otherwise my consciousness would have to reside in another. This knowledge would have become a very relative knowledge and would by no means be an absolute knowledge. And so if you're thinking of yourself only as yourself in a moment, then something else will have to hold your idea of you. Otherwise, you have an incomplete knowledge of who you are. So this is an odd idea, but your notion is a piece of a larger whole, and yet you have to understand this. And we're going back to that discussion we just had of Hegel, but I would also encourage you to possibly add on top of that layer of confusion, once again, to return to Berkeley and this idea that all things exist in the mind, and it's only in the mind as expression. So when you're thinking about yourself, that somebody else would have to be thinking about you too, to hold you there in this union. And this was Berkeley's defense or argument for the existence of God. Because we have to have something that's necessarily going to hold all of these thoughts together, even when we're not able to hold all of these thoughts together in our own mind. Otherwise, the universe would seem to blink in and out of existence with our own notions in confusion. But how it would be possible for every single moment to become aware also of its eternal validity as a moment in the whole. And this is why you need that outside mind, that outside intellect, things that are referred to as the agent intellect in a lot of medieval philosophy, and borrowing from Aristotle as well. That after all would require that the individual is omniscient and that the world is finished. That the single individual could become conscious of the eternal, he could perhaps grasp. As in earlier philosophy, presumably that he had thought that he had grasped it too. That is, if there had been anything at all. But to become conscious of the eternal in the whole historical concretion, indeed, according to the standard, that it did not involve only the past, this, he believed, was reserved for the deity. The agent intellect is talked by Avicenna, Varros, Al-Farabi, and others as well. Neither could he grasp as what instant in time a person would become so transfigured to himself that he, although he himself present to himself, became a past to himself, that he believed that this had to be reserved for eternity, and that eternity was only an abstract present in time. And here we can talk about the notion of eternity and the perspective of eternity when we think about arguments of free will with Boethius as well, and draw this connection once more. Insofar as there had been any earlier philosophy, the individual philosopher presumably would also have used his predecessors, would have perceived that he could appropriate this, correct that, etc. But it possibly would not occur to him to want to see through the eternal necessity by which one philosopher emerged from another, and he himself from his predecessors, in an eternal continuity. Even though thinking about the past could succeed in gaining an imitation of the inner necessity of this kind, please note that there is a distance to the past, the greater the possibility of illusion. It seemed to him that with regard to the present, it was an impossibility. This did not obtain permission to become the present out of the eagerness to become a past. The sooner the better, but this way it would become neither. He clarified this for himself by considering personal life, which is always helpful to go back to a concrete example. This will help you understand and how you should be moving forward. When someone looks back over his life, it may appear, particularly an earlier part of it, to be predetermined by necessity. However, if someone beginning in a specific period of time in his life wants to first become conscious of this and an eternal validity as an element in his life, he will precisely thereby prevent it from acquiring significance, for he will nullify it before it has been by wanting that which is present to manifest itself to him in that very instant as past. Again, this is the argument that Boethius makes about the timelessness of God and therefore not taking away our notions of free will. That God is able to look back at the past and at the future and be knowledgeable of all of that, but that doesn't make one thing necessary. That just makes it what it was. That doesn't eliminate choice and decision. That doesn't eliminate you as the agent in this unfolding. But that's Boethius' argument. Hegel's is fairly similar, that there's this unfolding world Geist that is moving and directing you, but curbs maybe some possibility of this will of you as the individual. Concluding on 142 and moving on to 143, it would already be a precarious matter, so it seemed to him, for someone to undertake to prophesy, to have this ahistorical look at history. Right? And yet, just as one could have an imitation of the necessity in the past, was it not also conceivable that one could also have an imitation of the necessity of the future? Philosophy, however, wanted to do something even more difficult than having this view from eternity. It wanted to permeate everything with a thought of eternity and necessity. It wanted to do this in the present moment, which would mean slaying to the present with a thought of eternity, and yet preserving its fresh life. And it's wanting to get rid of just what's possible and talk about what's necessary and make that what everything is. It would mean wanting to see what is happening as that which has happened, and simultaneously as that which is happening. It would mean wanting to know the future as a present, and yet simultaneously as a future. This is the difficulty of trying to look at this concept of knowledge from this larger unfolding. This is a critique he's having of Hegel and this unfolding Geist, and probably hinting a little bit more towards Boethius in this discussion. This is as far as Johannes Climacus came in his consideration of that thesis. It did not happen as quickly as the telling of it here. It cost him time and hard work, but he was poorly rewarded for his troubles. That's unfortunate. If he were to have an opinion about the implications of the thesis under discussion, it would have been this, that it was an impossibility. Yet he did not have the courage to believe this. He didn't have the courage to continue to advance this idea, that he simply thought, I don't get it, as opposed to, it is impossible. We're told the alternate line to end this paragraph is that he decided to shelve the thesis for the time being and turn his attention to the other two. In many ways, this is kind of what we have to do. We've introduced a lot of ideas, possibility and necessity, and also notions of will and what your freedom is if indeed you're a part of a larger whole, and how you need to look and shape and construct this idea. There's some heavy lifting involved, but this is where we've gone, and this is what we need to move forward when we get to the next section.